Welcome to the Primary, Secondary, and Tertiary Sources tutorial for English 316 Library Instruction. If you've already covered these topics in class, you can safely ignore this video. If you haven't, then information will be useful for you as we go through some of the other tutorials and during our in-class discussion. The purpose of the tutorial is to help you identify and differentiate between primary, secondary, and tertiary data sources, identify the roles of these sources in research, and discern the value and validity of sources. So what is a primary source? It's basically any original material. It could be from the relevant time period. It's typically unfiltered through evaluation or interpretation. It's often the first formal appearance in a published format, and it presents original thinking, reporting of a discovery, or sharing of new information. Now, whether a source is primary or not may really depend on the discipline or the context. For example, if you're doing a study on comets, a newspaper article detailing the discovery of a new comet would probably be considered a secondary source because it's reporting on the presentation of the data by the scientists and not from the scientists themselves. However, if you are doing a report on how science is reported in the news media, a newspaper report about a scientific topic could very well be a primary source because that's the original presentation in the news media. That's going to be true for any type of source, whether it's primary, secondary, or even sometimes tertiary. It really depends on the context. So some examples of primary sources are artifacts, physical objects, the original object themselves, diaries, journal articles. That's the one we'll typically be using here in a college paper. And here we usually want peer-reviewed articles. Letters, photographs, patents, websites, records, any of these things could be considered primary sources. So how do you find them? Again, it really depends on the discipline and the context of the resource. If you need a physical object or photograph, artwork, you're probably going to have to go to where they are located, to museums, special collections, in libraries, archives, etc. For papers that you're going to be writing here in 316, the primary sources you'll be looking for are typically peer-reviewed journal articles. And in that case, we have a variety of sources. We could go to general purpose databases such as Scopus, Web of Science, and others like those that are very broad and cover a lot of disciplines. Or you could go for specialized indexes or databases in your specific topic. If you're doing astronomy, for example, the ADS Abstract Service indexes every paper ever written in astronomy, and you would probably want to start there. Or maybe the ACM Digital Library for computer science, or MathSciNet for math and statistics. So what is a secondary source? This is a set of information that is generally not contemporary to an event, but rather discusses and evaluates the event. So maybe it's a book evaluating and comparing different search algorithms versus the journal articles that presented how they actually work. In some cases, secondary sources will evaluate a primary source and their credibility, or they may synthesize material from multiple primary sources into a single discussion or review and compare and contrast them and provide analysis of them. Secondary sources often include items such as biographies, newspaper articles, and journal articles. And some secondary sources can, as I said before, can also be considered primary sources or even tertiary sources, depending on the discipline and how they're being used. Some examples. This is a web page, kind of a press release from the New Horizons mission that recently flew by Pluto and is still sending back data. In this case, they summarize a series of papers that were presented at a scientific conference and summarize the findings that were presented. The second one, Coders at Work, is a book that contains biographies of 15 different software developers and how they work and what they do. And so it's not an autobiography could be considered a primary source as that's written by the author, but a biography written by someone else about someone would be considered a secondary source. Finding secondary sources are probably the easiest. Most school libraries, most academic libraries will have a wide variety of secondary sources. They often provide accounts, commentary on the event, referencing primary sources, and are typically more numerous. So next, what's a tertiary source? A tertiary source is information that is derived from consulting primary and secondary sources and synthesizing it even more. It's typically not as thorough as the original primary source. They're often found in collections containing various types of information. They provide a condensed version of the topic by summarizing the information gathered. They're typically written for a broad general audience, so they're simpler language, less jargon, and greater breadth. And they're often preferable when looking up quick facts or a general overview. They're a great place to start your research if you don't know anything really about a topic, because they give you a broad general overview. Some examples are things like almanacs, dictionaries, encyclopedias, including Wikipedia, which is probably the most heavily used encyclopedia in the world now. Tertiary sources in a library are typically found in the reference section. A lot of times there are multi-volume sets, so they're not available for checkout, although some tertiary sources are found in the regular stacks. And there's also a lot of library databases, such as WorldCat, that provide information regarding tertiary sources. And when you use a tertiary source in writing a paper, remember to look for those sources that reference back to the primary and secondary sources from where they get their information, because that'll provide you with a trail of sources that you can then cite. You typically won't cite a tertiary source in a paper, but you'll use it for background and for finding other things of interest.